Good morning or afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're tuning in from. This presentation is family planning, looking at taking a plan and turning it into a complex family structure. And this is a presentation that I had planned for Midwest University last year before it got canceled, like so many other items. So we'll see how much of it remained in my memory. My name is Julie Kidder. I'm the architect and BIM director at the Hartman Majewski Design Group in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've been using Revit for close to 10 years now, and I've been working at the design group for going on 9 years this July. I have been a registered architect for 2 going on 3 years. At our firm, we do multiple project typologies. So we need to have families and content for healthcare, multifamily residential, education, government work. It really runs the gamut and makes it an exciting content library to try to build and maintain. The learning objectives are to evaluate what you need to look for when you're building a family. What do you need to think about? Because it's much harder to go back to an existing family, especially a complex family, and add features. It's much easier to plan them from the beginning. What are the elements of the family building process? So, what functionality do you need? How are you going to integrate items? And do you have templates that you need to work with? Are you going to use any scripted tasks? How do you prevent family failure? Work with testing and adding formulas to make sure that the family won't break if the user enters the wrong input. How can you create a fail safe rather than the can't make type error? And how do you go about trying to educate users on what the intent of the family is and how it works, and make sure you have the features that are needed to work for all of your projects that you might have? So the first part is to start a plan. What do you want to build a family for? One of the best reasons is to meet the graphic standards of what you want to see, or your company wants to see, or your client wants to see. If you're sourcing families from a bunch of different places, they're going to look and behave differently. So if you start building your own family libraries and you build complex families that you use every day, you can control how those look through all stages of the design, from a schematic view where it might be shade to construction drawings where you need to have the frame wrapping a wall. What information do you need to schedule? And are you going to be rendering objects from the model? And how do you make sure you have the features that allow your rendering to convey your intent as you want to the client or to developers? And building a family can help reduce repeat work. If you have families that meet the needs of what you're trying to present and model regularly, it saves time because you don't have to go and search for something that meets the needs of each project, and you don't have the need for multiple people to be looking for families that may meet the need in different ways. You can also resolve regular frustrations. So if a family that you're currently using consistently doesn't achieve what you need it to do, by building a family, you can start working those out initially and make sure that those frustrations don't occur, which allows everyone to focus on the task at hand, which is creating the documents and the renderings, models, rather than trying to figure out why a family is breaking. You can reduce model clutter. If you're bringing in families from outside sources, they often bring with them many different materials, shared parameters, and inconsistencies, which makes it harder to schedule. And Also, if you have a consistent family structure, you can automate some of the drudgery, like, dealing with names or validating information. If you have families that are flexible, you can plan to accommodate atypical project requirements that you see. For example, if you have new walls that you're putting over existing structure, can a door sit within them? These families were designed for that. If you can adjust families to meet manufacturers' information, you can verify in submittals what you are actually going to see and make sure it still meets your design intent. And you can easily swap out components like the frames you see in the picture, because that allows you to make changes that are needed quickly and have the information convey throughout your model. I did forget to say at the beginning that most of these examples are going to be from the doors that families that I started building probably in 2018 and started planning well before that to resolve some of our typical needs. And when we build a family, we can help verify. There's swings to deal with clash detection. We can have accurate sizes of components, which make model validation a lot easier. Clearances, whether they're for accessibility or access requirements for equipment. And you can get owner-occupant buy-in of design easier if you can make sure it's going to match what they will see when a structure is constructed. If you have a very basic representation, it makes it a lot harder to walk them through the model and say, this is what it's going to look like. And no one likes it when the client comes back and goes, this isn't what I was thinking of and I don't like it. And one of my favorite things about building a family is you get to learn how the families work. You can build custom families faster if you start building them regularly. You can become more adept at diagnosing those issues when you find that things are breaking. And by creating content that's specific to your firm's need, you can have what it is at hand, and it makes it a lot easier to pull a project together and focus on actual creation of a project rather than chasing down a family that gets the point across. Like all things, there's some good aspects and bad aspects of trying to design and build your own families. It's great. It gives you control over design. You can have specific graphics that meet what you need for your firm or for a client. You can make sure it works with your project templates and the standards in your region or within your firm. And you can document them as you go, which makes it much easier to have training and help available for people using the family. Downside is that it does take time to build and to plan and to fix. You have to have a certain amount of skill to be able to design them and create them, and that takes some time to develop. And often it's the editing and creation of families is limited to only a couple of people because not everybody either wants to edit families or has the time and inclination to learn how to edit those. And even when you have others that do know how to edit the families, if you have a really complex family, it's still much faster for the person who designed it to make those edits. So, where to start? Evaluate what you're using now. What issues are there with current methods? And what changes would make the most difference? In the door, you see a project that we did before I rebuilt the door library. And our doors were fairly robust before, but there was a variety of things that they didn't do well, like handling custom frame types. It was harder to add custom door leaf that was needed in this project than was desirable. And there wasn't an easy way to add the hardware that was important for the for renderings to look right. Starting to see door protection, especially in our hospital environments, is important to think about, because then it makes it much easier to have conversations about, well, what sort of door protection do you need, versus not seeing it at all. So there's a lot of parallels from the world of coding, designing websites, building programs, that really parallels how families are built. And one of those is the creation of user stories. And in coding, that's done to explain how you want a product to work, or how you want a user to interact with a website. And it really helps to think about the same thing with Revit families, because if you can describe some specific situations, it helps identify what you need, expectations of how a family would be interacted with, how it will look, how the data will be stored and retrieved. And then those can guide development and help outline some features. So a couple of the stories that I had when designing these doors was that we needed doors to be able to have different paint colors on each side of the door, because on an exterior door, it may need to match the exterior finish, but the interior, it would need to match whatever the finished paint color was. And then we still needed the door to report what its core material was in the schedule. So that was something that we needed the doors to do. That story doesn't tell me how I'm going to achieve that. It's just one item that I need to find a way to solve. Another one of the frustrations with our current doors was we needed to be able to see clearances in our working views, but they didn't need to show up in all the sheeted views. And in our original doors, you either had them on everywhere or you had them off everywhere. There wasn't a way to see them in some views and not in others. What are your requirements for the family? What capabilities do they need to have? You need render, schedule, what should be a type property, what should be an instance property? Are there existing templates or standards that the families need to match? Obviously, for something like doors, there are a lot of code requirements that influence doors. There may be local or client-specific standards that the doors need to, or that your families need to meet. And if you are working with a template, an existing template, then you need to, you may need to meet those existing schedule standards that you're already using. And then are there user expectations that will facilitate the adoption or use of the families? It doesn't detract from what you're trying to change or improve with the family. So something like if people are used to looking in a certain location, if people want to store materials or name families in a way that you've already got standardized, that's something that you may want to look at continuing. Research, especially with families that there is a long-standing need for, or in the that people have been building, you want to see how have other people built those families, and look at what works, what doesn't work. You'll get some ideas of how different areas could be built, and you'll see some things that maybe won't work for your firm. There are a lot of door families out there, and I looked at ones I could access when I started planning. And okay, there are some really neat ways about how they were being done, and there are some that I felt wouldn't necessarily meet the needs of design group and how people were used to using families and the features that we liked having in other areas. Figure out what Revit's limitations are. Revit is by no means a perfect program, and there are things that Revit doesn't do well, and that makes you need workarounds, or certain ideas have to um, be discarded until a point when they might work. One of my pet peeves is that I can't have a child family tell a parent family anything about itself, which means I have to look at how to pass that information in a different way, or how to not need that information. Are there relevant codes that are related to your family? Doors, there's plenty of them. There's ANSI and ADA and IBC and local codes. So what are those and how might I need to convey them? Also look at if there's any standard terminology for your industry pieces, and that changed. I started using, hinge versus latch, pull, push, and using things like leaf and panel, because those were terms that the door industry used to describe how their doors were built. And that would make the family more accessible. If other people used it, they could search for a term on Google and they would come up with the same description rather than moving slab of vertical wood. So one of the aspects in the doors that I was initially very frustrated with and planned to change was where the origin was located. It annoyed me that I couldn't do a one-click place and get it in the right location based on where the hinge was located. And so I really wanted to change that. And after some research, I realized that there was a good reason not to change that, was because if I had, then the door flip would stop behaving the way it was expected. And so in the end, both because it was standard, so if we had to use an outside family, it would also change the location. Then there is that we flip a door back and forth a lot more than we need to actually place the door initially. So it may take me twice as long to place the door correctly initially, but it saves time from having to move doors around each time I decide to change which way the door swings. What is your function? So how does that family need to behave? What features are you needed? Are there ones that are new? If they're new, you may want to start testing those before you start building the family and decide how they're going to work and integrate them back into a whole family. What are your outlier cases and how might they be handled? Are you going to be using Dynamo scripts? If you aren't familiar with Dynamo and you really want to use them, start playing around with that. Understand what you can pull out of a model and how that might need to work. It's really important to find a way to document what you are doing and how you are doing it. I end up using Google Docs so that I could work on them from anywhere. And because I was the only person that was working on building these door families, but any sort of platform and notebook that you can track this information consistently works. But it really helps to track what your current problems are, what you're working on, what your desired features are, what solutions you've researched, what your decisions were about how you're going to tackle something. Because if you have to go back and decide, figure out why you've done something before, or if you have a gap in when you can work on a project that takes a lot of time, like building a family, you can go back and see where you were last and jump right back in, rather than spending a lot of time figuring out where you were and what you were doing. And that's something that happened with the doors a lot, because I do build doors. I am the BIM director, but I also am working on projects. And so I would have periods of time when I needed to be working on a project deadline and I wouldn't be able to work on family building for weeks at a time. So create a plan. What are you going to be doing? What's important? What do you need for agency documentation, for your plan submittals, for your renderings, for your code reviews, for your schedules? And I created a spreadsheet for which they were and started thinking about how I would need to handle types, whether they were instance or type parameters, for how I was tracking each information in the item. Figure out your naming schema. Your firm might already have one, and that's great. You may need to figure out how your new family fits into that and use that so that your library is consistent. If you don't have that, start thinking about what makes sense for your library. In our case, we prefix everything with a specification division. And then I wanted to make sure that they'd sort in a Windows Explorer tab correctly. So looking at how to make that information cascade. Are you going to use nested families? In the case of something complex like doors, definitely I was using nested families. Shared families, what are the pros and cons of those? What makes sense? In our case, I was using shared parameters because I wanted to be able to quickly switch them out in the project environment and easily add new types to switch those out. So most of the families are shared. What is your creation priority? What is going to be either the first part of a nested family that you need to make the complete whole, or what is going to be most important or useful to your family or to your firm? So with the doors, I identified 7 types that I felt were required to be available to be able to roll out the rebuilt doors to the firm. And those doors would cover about 90% of what we did on a regular basis. And then outliers would still have to be use other families. Those were a single door, double egress, uneven pair doors, and curtain wall doors of the couple of the types above, the single and the double equal. And with those, I felt we could achieve most of what we did on a regular basis. Obviously, other doors would get added as they were needed and as I have time to build them, but this gave us a basis to really integrate them and start using them. And this also gave me sort of a focus on what I needed to start with to make it happen. Now that we have that initial plan, now we need to sort of start building our first families. So, scaffold. Whenever you're building families, create the bones first. This is the first family that I started with was a nested door panel. It was important to have that to start working with swings to understand how that was going to sit within the frames. So starting with that door panel. Put in the reference planes and give them names so that you know what they do. Even if you think you know what they do now, name them because you need to know what they do 6 months and 6 years later. And anybody who opens your family should be able to understand what your intent was. Name these families per your building plan, create and those references and start documenting what you are doing now. It's much harder to go back through your families and figure out what you did later. Once you have those references, start building those muscles that are going to control those bones. So add your length parameters. Start looking at adding formulas where they're needed. And flex the parameters. Flexing is a really important tact in family building to make sure your family is going to work at every stage. Don't wait until you have a finished family in the project and a user tells you that it stops working if they change how wide it is. Always make sure that you can change your major dimensions, and that you can change angles. Anything that is meant to be changed, test it constantly in the family environment, in test project environments. So with the door leaf, I made sure before I modeled any elements in the family, I made sure that I could change the width and the height and the thickness of that panel, and that those reference planes moved the way I expected them to. So one of the ways that I commented my family is I had a spreadsheet of every parameter that I was using in every family, every formula that might be controlling that, if it was going to have a tooltip, as well as an explanation for what it did or why I used it that way. Especially when you're still developing a family, you can add text notes to explain where you are currently working or a bug you have to fix. And tooltips, even on working parameters, are really helpful because being able to go back and find out what you did is very helpful. And with a spreadsheet, especially with a complex family like the doors that have many families, it made it a lot easier for me to either pull a formula that I needed without opening a family, or to figure out which family was using that formula so that I could go and see how it was behaving in a project. Now that we have those initial bones, we need to add some flesh. And in that case, those are items like extrusions and sweeps, blends, what you need to make your project, your family look correct. So for the door, that was a panel. In this, the been shown that's the more complex panel that, or door leaf that also had an inset panel. So adding those forms, making sure they're in the right subcategories, and flex. Make sure that the door width still behaves as you expect it to. Make sure that you can move anything that's angled. And if you are arraying anything, which would happen with a nested family into a host family, make sure that array behaves as you expect. Keep adding complexity. So once I had a door, then I built a frame, clearances, and started nesting those all together until I got to the point where I had a host door family. And that host door family comprised all the elements that I needed to make a workable door. I have the parameters that were linked through into the host family, because, for example, width. I tell the family that I placed in the project how wide it is, and that width has to then propagate to the frame, to the door panel, to the clearances, the swings, the location of the hardware. And ensure that the family still flexes correctly. As soon as you have something that's loadable that you can load into a project, load it into a project. Does it behave the way you want? And I would use new test projects each time so that it wouldn't maintain any parameters or holdovers from the past families that I was testing. Build. Now that you have some families, you can keep going. So working around Revit's oddities and restrictions. It would be really nice if we could have a way to tell Revit that we only want to see certain families appear in a family type dropdown. We can't. It's everything of a category. So the workaround that I use for clearances, where I had one clearance family that was going to work for both sides, was that I have a type parameter that tells the family what sort of clearance it is. And then when I place it into the project, I link a parameter that tells that instance of the place family what sort of parameter it is. If it matches, great, it displays the set information. If it doesn't match, it uses the maximum possible clearances for that situation that is placed. So if you start seeing a door that has latch clearances and hinge clearances and is deeper maybe than you expect, then you should click on it and figure out why it's doing that, because you accidentally misclicked and you picked the wrong door clearance for that side. So that's one example of how you can use formulas to keep them from working, or keep them working correctly without creating errors that break the family. And one of those that is likely to break families is if you have arrays in your family and they go below 2. So you want to have, every time I have an array in a family, I have several control parameters that make sure that that array never gets below 2, but then changes the visibility of that array and hides it if the user desires an array count of less than 2. And that prevents that error. If you have anything that's controlling a width, especially if it's something that somebody might think to set to 0, then you probably want to have a safety parameter that keeps that from being too small. In the panel doors that I showed, I have a safety that makes sure that that panel doesn't get below 1 inch wide, because that would break the family. And we have, in our doors, we wanted the ability to offset both in the positive and negative direction from origin, which is something that Revit doesn't really like to do. So I have a user input that does take that negative number, and then a couple of formulas that make sure that the length that the Revit family sees is only going to be a positive number. And all of these parameters that I don't expect the user to interact with, I group in other, because other sorts to the very bottom of the family dialog. And I make sure, and so anything that I want a user to interact with, I don't put in the other category. They drop to the bottom and they're easy to ignore. Also, add tooltips. It's one way to comment your work. So even for parameters that the user shouldn't be interacting with, I'll add a note. And it can explain to the users to how a family should be used, or what or parameter is doing. What's great about tooltips is that they are available right there. They don't have to go and find the PDF or something on your internet or the internet to define how a family is to be used. They can hover over it and see what they need to do. And so I make a lot of use of tooltips to tell the user how to work with a family. So one of the things is with those clearances and every other family type parameter, I have a clearance telling the user what that family should be, have its name prefix be, so that they have at least one way to try to make sure that they're picking the right family, because there's only so much you can do to keep something complex like a frame being put in for a door leaf, which will inevitably break families. The important thing with tooltips is that if you're using shared parameters, you have to put in all of the tooltips at the time you create that shared parameter. You can't go back and easily, at least, edit shared parameter tooltips after they are created. There's certainly probably some workarounds with various plugins, but it's not something you can natively do in Revit. So That's why it's important to have that plan, because then you can go back through and know that you have everything there from the beginning. Now that you have your key elements in your family, you can go back and start adding some of the remaining parameters. Add your visibility parameters. Make sure that you have your settings as you need them for coarse, medium, and fine views. Look at the materials. Make sure you have those linked through. If you are using painted surfaces, take care of that. And make sure that you have any parameters for schedules and scripts that need to be added at the family level. For example, one of the things that we have hard coded into the families is how many door leafs there are going to be. And that's used to display the widths correctly on our schedule. Plan for future features. So think about what you may want your complex family to do. And even if you aren't ready to do those, you don't have time to do it yet, think about adding that information in tooltips or any parameters that might be needed for that function that you're aware of. So when I built the doors, what I determined that there was the 7 types that I wanted to have to roll out the family. But I knew there was other doors that I need to add. So our tooltip mentions all of those doors that I plan to add. And so when I built them, there wasn't a barn door. When I came back and built that barn door family, I already had that option built in because I knew it was something I was going to do when I built the family. Now that you have that first family, test and make sure it works. Change the sizes. Does it offset correctly? Does the door panel open? Keep testing. Each time, think of all the different ways that that family might behave, and try to test a selection. Obviously, you're not going to test every single interaction, but it's better to go kind of crazy and pick a size that may be much larger than you'd ever actually have a single leaf door, for example. And if that works, probably everything in between will too. Once you think you have those bugs worked out, start working on the next family and keep testing. So in coding, there's something that's called a minimum viable product. And that's sort of the baseline that you need to have to be able to get a decent amount of user feedback. It's relatively functional. And you can roll that out, and then you can really start getting a wider bug testing. And so in family building, what are those sort of key features and items that you need to make that family usable? And remembering that there are some challenges with adding parameters or features later where it gets harder. And so in my case, that was what I'd planned to have for our 2019 template rollout for the doors. That was those 7 families, a few selections of different door leaf and frame types, and a few different hardware types. And that I felt would get us most of the way and could really get people to start using them, finding any errors in the family, and making sure that it worked and would do what we needed it to do. And then keep building families. What do you need for implementation? So I created additional door leaf types. I'd been working mostly with a solid door in design, and started working in adding glass and louvers because those were the 2 most likely panels that we were going to add. Keep documenting to ensure consistency, and keep testing. Then once you have a few families or even one family, you can start looking at mimicking your actual projects. So those user stories that you came up with during planning, mimic those. If there's been projects that you've had issues with your current iteration of families, try to make those work. Can you make them work better? If you're using your existing template, or even if you're working on creating a new one, how are those families going to work in your views? Do you need to change subcategories? Do you need to change what your object styles are? Do you need to change your view templates? And look for opportunities where your in-progress family may be better than what you already have. I was still building the families when we had a project for a linear accelerator, which requires a very heavy-duty vault door, which has a custom frame. Our existing families couldn't handle that custom frame. Rather than building it from scratch, I built it to work with the in-progress door family. And it not only got what I needed for the construction documents, it also gave me a good opportunity to test and see that there was some visibility family items that I needed to change in templates, and that there were also some constraint issues that I wouldn't have necessarily found without testing it in this way. And this is what the doors, I'd rebuilt the doors to do. So it was a great way to test. Create your schedules. If you are reporting your information, what are you going to report and how do you get that information in? If you have any project parameters or calculated parameters, add those. One of the things for working schedules that I really like is that we now have the ability to do colored fills, which was not an option before. And that allowed me to convey to the users what fields were calculated and didn't need to be touched, what fields they needed to input information in, and what fields should be filled out by running a Dynamo script. Plan for your outliers. I made sure that our scripts or our schedules could handle working with doors that weren't in our library. And consider how unique conditions might be handled. You don't need to necessarily build those, but one of the things that I would do is every time I'd see a door in the wild was I would go, well, how would my families handle that? How would I build that door? And if I could think about how I would build that family and it would work, great. If it was something that I didn't, I kept thinking about how I would do that and what changes I might need to make to my family to make that work. Create scripts. It helps if you have a decent number of your families or them to start testing and building scripts. I probably could have started building scripts earlier. I waited until near the end to make that work because I knew that I built them so that they could be used even if that script wasn't ready. And start with some simple tasks and then keep testing frequently on a draft model and look at ways to reduce the amount of user input that might be needed. So in the end, the script was both validated the model and pushed information from child families to the parent host to appear in the schedule, pushed material information into the schedule, and double checked things like fire ratings and fixed up some naming of all those nested families. So because we wanted the family, the materials, and the nested door types to be the ones that had the information about materials and then reported those back to the host family, one of the things that the script does is if the material hasn't been set, it'll tell the user what they need to do to get that to run, to look correct when they next run the script. So it actually will say, you need to set the material. You need to edit the material mark because you've set the material, but it doesn't have the information I need. Then implement. How do you roll it out? Add the families to your library, add the schedules and selected families to the template. These were the different door types that were initially added to the template from those. There's 5 families in the template, 7 total in the library. And then take those documentation that you've been doing all along, maybe rough, and clean it up to make it so that anyone can use it. And have presentations all along to get some feedback, but definitely when you're rolling it out. And have those presentations that people can refer back to it anytime they might be using it. And ask for feedback. The more your families are used, the more likely there are going to be errors, or for someone to go, oh, I have a project that really needs this family, but maybe with this additional tweak. And so that gives you a way to test your families and get them out in the wild. And one of my first presentations, I had a coworker that said, great, I have a project that could use this, but I need a different frame type. And we took care of that. And keep bug fixing. That's a continual item. And so even fairly recently, I've found that the transom door frame I'd made didn't work with double doors because it was broken. So made the fix, back into the library. Thank you. I appreciate everyone joining. And I know I have some questions, so I'll see about taking a look at those. And anything that I don't get to, I'll see if there's a way to get that answer to you later. So the first question is, how do you determine whether it's a family parameter or a shared parameter? So shared parameters are anything that needs to appear in tags, or that might need to appear in tags. It's also anything that I need consistent information across several families. So most of the parameters that are appearing in the schedules are going to be shared parameters because I have multiple families that need that information, and I need to be able to have that information be identical across the board. And so if it's something that I had families that or parameters that I thought I could do as family parameters, and I went back and I changed them to shared parameters when I determined I needed to do something more with them. It's also important if you're trying to use those values in a schedule, they also have to be shared parameters. So while there are some that I'm not going to display in a tag, I needed to be able to filter schedules on that information. How do I organize my parameters? So I had a fairly, I don't use the groups necessarily for what their title is, but more for how they're going to group parameters. I figured out what order they would appear to the user. Like I said earlier, everything that was a working item would be in the other category because it would drop to the bottom. And then I had others that I would group together. So, I use set parameters for everything that controlled the way hinges and leaves and frames sat in the model. And materials obviously were grouped together. Dimensions were pretty straightforward, but I sort of took some of the other parameter groupings and just to make sure that they grouped separately and made them a little bit easier to find. So graphics was where swings ended up, whether or not it was for graphics, it kept them separate from other parameters. So think about what you need, how they might be grouped, and look at what order they're going to appear to the user in, because you don't want something that a user has to interact with every day to drop to the bottom. I use a lot of constraints in construction because those sort to the top. I'll do something different if we ever get the option to change those. Next question is, you mentioned not seeing the clearances for the doors and all the views, but did not mention how I accomplished that. So what I ended up doing was the original doors didn't have the clearances on a subcategory in the door family. So now the clearances are on two subcategories, one for plan view and one for the 3D view, so that those can be controlled independently. The 3D view is great for verification and clash detection. The 2D is just there for plans. There's also an invisible line that is there regardless. So even if you've tried to turn them off, you still see them when you select that door. So it's very hard to ignore if your clearance is colliding with walls. And then, like I said, I have the ability to, it tells you if you get the wrong, if you've chosen the wrong clearance. All the doors start out with a default front approach clearance. Then you can go back and turn them off if you've got a closet that doesn't need any, or you have a different approach style. How do you determine whether you integrate the main family model or a nested model? Generally, I have in the host model doesn't have anything that is just in the host model. Everything that is in it is a nested family. Let me go back quickly to the one showing them pulled apart. So each of those families was nested. And that's part of because these doors were so complex. But even in any family where I'm going to switch out components, those are going to be nested in. Any family where I'm going to array components, those array items are nested in. In general, the coast family, I want to have only things that are only going to be valid for that host family. And so for doors, that was nothing was only going to be valid for the single host family. Everything might be used in another family. So are there clearances for doors in a nested family? So the clearances themselves are nested families, and they are nested in relation to the door hinge or opening, depending on the family. And so everything that is nested is not meant to be placed on its own in the case of the doors. The way we name our families is that there is an underscore at the beginning. So those families that shouldn't be placed on there independently sort to the bottom of any sort of family type selection dropdown. So the doors always come with clearances built in. Did I find the door families to be extremely large in size? To be honest, I've never actually looked at how big they are. I probably could. The size wasn't what mattered. What mattered to me was how they worked. And we don't have an issue. Our computers are robust enough that we're not in a position that we might have been 20 or 30 years ago where the computers couldn't handle large sizes. So that's not something that has ever been a concern. Something with a bunch of CAD imports is going to be much more of an impact on our model performance than the size of the door families. How long did it take for me to get to that minimum viable product for my Revit template? Well, there's the sort of chronological time, which took into account that I had a bunch of other projects I was working on, and mostly I wasn't working on the doors full time. And then the actual sort of compressed time that would have been. I probably took over a year where I was just making notes about what I would like the families to do and what I, and testing out certain conditions or solutions I wanted to use. But that was something I was doing on the side when I had a few moments. I probably took a couple of months where I had a sort of a concentrated period of development. I think I started sort of in the late, like November, December of 2018, I think it would be, where I really had a concentrated period to finish them up for our rollout in the beginning of, I think it would be 2019. But it wasn't, if I could have worked consistently, it probably would have been a lot faster. Do I have a single master shared parameter for all projects in the office? We have one that is for everything that goes in the template. And then, so if projects have specific shared parameters that are unique to their project, they get a supplementary one. And then anything that is valid will get worked back in. But all of my door parameters are in the shared and the single master shared parameter file that we have. How frequently do I use Dynamo in family building? I haven't used it for family building yet. I've mainly focused on using it to get information between parameters that I can't do in Revit. So I've focused more on the sort of either the schedule side or on pushing information between families. I'd be interested in using it for family building if there's a way to speed that up, but that isn't something I've started with yet, and certainly wasn't where I was at in my Dynamo journey at the time I was building the families initially. How do you organize my nested family types that appear in the parameters? So I don't use different categories to limit the choice a user has, because that causes problems with visibility in templates. That was our problem with the clearances in our old door family. They were generic models. And so if you couldn't easily control those independently, it didn't work the way users would expect. And then also we're using a lot of categories. And so the more different categories if I try to use those, you'd end up seeing some really weird families in the door selection. So I named them consistently, and I told the user what they needed to be named with. And then it's up to the user to make sure that that name matches the family type that should fit in that slot. I would love a way to put a filter on those family type drop downs and say, only if the name begins with this, show it, but that's not an option. So that's the solution that I've come up with that meets the needs for we're doing with sort of a minimal amount of side effects given what our options are. And we are at the hour, but I'm happy to stay and continue answering a couple of questions I've got left. How did you handle curtain wall doors panels versus the actual doors? So the doors hosting the walls were built first. The curtain wall doors are true curtain wall doors, and they were built second. And then I sort of figured out what the behavior elements need to be. And much of they all use nested families. So it was only a certain amount of parameters or dimensions that I needed to sort of rebuild from scratch in that curtain wall door template. And what are good door references, family references online? So I looked at a lot of a lot of forum posts. So they weren't necessarily always family information, but I was looking at how other people had built or what other issues people were encountering and how they were tackling them. The one door family that I really did take a look at was Aaron Mahler's from Parallax, and he's got a great door family. But there is both that I had needs that I wanted to explore how to address, and there was certain things that I felt would be challenging to change how we used families. I learned a lot from the discussions on Revit Forum and some other places about how to make the doors work. And I also looked at, some of the Omni families where I didn't get a chance to actually play with them, but seeing all the different options that they offered gave me an idea about various options I needed to consider including in my family. So I think that looks like I answered all the questions. I appreciate everyone joining, and certainly take a look and let me go back. let me know if you have any questions, send me an email. And I'll try to answer your questions. And the Revit community is great, and it's great to share and learn from everybody. So thank you.